I'm Richard Reeves. I'm a Senior Fellow in Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution, where I'm also Director of the Future of the Middle Class Initiative, and I'm a regular visitor to Brookings Mountain West here at UNLV.
I'm Jenny Schuetz. I'm a Fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings and also associated with the Future of the Middle Class Initiative, and this is my very first visit to UNLV in Brookings Mountain West.
So Jenny, it's your first time out here. I've done it a few times now as a visiting scholar with our partners, Brookings Mountain West, out here at UNLV. How have you found it? You've done some teaching before, so obviously you've been in classrooms a lot, but you've been meeting with students, scholars, you did a public event. You've actually done a full week, especially for a first time. And what have been your initial reactions to?
It's been a fantastic week, both to get to know the students and the scholars here and to get to know the city a little bit. So I really enjoyed getting to do the brief on Las Vegas and look at lots of data. And the first thing they did when I got here on Monday morning was put me in a car and drive me around to go look at giant housing developments in the suburbs, which is sort of quintessential Las Vegas housing market. But it's been fantastic getting to meet with a bunch of students. I've gotten to teach a couple of the undergrad classes and a couple of the grad school classes, and the students are just terrific. They're really engaged, they've asked great questions. I'm very excited.
So you've taught at USC for sure. Have you taught anywhere?
I taught at City College of New York.
That's right, you're at CUNY as well,
yeah.
Right? And so,
which I think has some similarities in the student body.
In terms of what? Just lots of first gen, quite diverse?
First gen college, first gen immigrants and first generation, very diverse. Many of the students are working part-time, going to school part-time. They're all super interested in learning about the world and figuring out what they're going to do. So I think both of the student bodies are pretty idealistic and engaged with public sector issues.
Yeah. And care about public policy as well. Of
Absolutely.
course, that's the other thing that really I find quite refreshing coming here is there's a caring about public policy, but I've also been struck on a number of occasions by a number of students who are living public policy, in the sense that when you're talking about reforms of food stamps or K-12 education reform for English language learners and so on, a lot of the students who are writing about that here are those who've actually, it's a lived experience for them as well as just an intellectual experience.
Very much. And one of the things that's nice about studying housing is that everybody has some sense of it because everybody lives somewhere and people have their own stories about being renters. I was meeting with one of the students yesterday who told me that her father used to be a small business contractor in California before the recession, and his business went under because of the Great Recession and foreclosures. And so she really has experience with what happened to housing markets and what the repercussions are.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about Las Vegas kind of in a moment, but as part of the Future of the Middle Class Initiative, we're working on housing, and you're leading that strand of work. And one of the reactions sometimes that I get anyway is from people saying that housing is really an issue for poor people. It's an issue for the lowest income people. There's a homelessness issue. There's an affordability issue for really low income. Not so much for middle class families as those with more than 50 up to 100 and whatever $1,000 a year, that those are families who by no means rich, aren't also poor, at least using traditional definitions. And so can you talk a little bit about how you see different housing challenges affecting different groups in the income distribution or indeed in different cities? Because it's a very complex story, I think.
It is. The sort of easiest part of the story is that poor families, the 20% of the poorest families in the country, really just can't afford the rent or the mortgage anywhere. And that goes for expensive places like New York and relatively inexpensive places like rural Texas. The poorest 20% of families just earn too little to cover the operating costs of running a basic apartment. So there's a gap between incomes and rents that has to be met by subsidy. That's a pretty universal story. The more complicated story for middle income households is it depends on where you live. So if we're using our sort of future of the middle class definition, thinking about the 60 middle percent of the income distribution, people in the sort of bottom quintile of that group do have problems often covering basic housing costs, the rent or the mortgage, particularly if they live in expensive places. So if you're earning, say, $25,000 to $45,000 living in Las Vegas, you're paying a little bit more than a third of your income on rent, and that's more than we think is kind of a stable balance to be in. If you're in the middle income group and you live in a place like San Francisco or New York, you're likely to be paying a little bit more still, and you sort of make compromises in other ways. So one of the things that I found is that, for instance, families with kids who live in high-cost metros wind up crowding into smaller spaces to be able to afford housing. So you may wind up with parents, a couple of kids, and an aunt or grandparent who's sleeping on the couch in the living room. So the family is really shrinking their space in order to make ends meet. One of the other ways that people manage housing costs in expensive areas is by moving farther away from their job, and then they spend a lot of time commuting. So Riverside, California, which is not too far from here, is a perfect example. There are a lot of people who have jobs in Los Angeles and Orange County, but can't afford to live there, and so they live in Riverside, San Bernardino, and then they commute more than an hour each way every day to get to work.
Right, so it'd be fair to say that the bottom half of the middle class, however you define it, so not poor, but middle class, probably some labor income. There are people in employment, and that you have to make these trade-offs. I think that's the phrase you've used in your previous work, is trade-offs around income, housing, commuting, crowding, etc., in different metros and in different places. And what are the, before I'll come on to Las Vegas in a minute, but when you think about housing and the middle class and the quality of life of the middle class, particularly in the context of wealth, and broad housing policy, before we kind of zoom in, right? My sense about US housing policy is that it does a pretty good job of subsidizing people who can afford to get expensive mortgages through the mortgage interest deduction, and it does a patchy job of helping the poorest through tax credits and so on, albeit to not anything like this extent we need. But that the housing market for the middle class, doesn't work quite as well as it should, perhaps because we overemphasize home ownership, perhaps because there are just barriers to entry, etc. And this whole issue about wealth. Can you talk a little bit about the policy framework around housing for the middle class and how we could improve it?
Yeah, I mean, the US doesn't have one housing policy. We have a bunch of different policies. And actually, one of the ways that we most consistently deal with housing is through the federal income tax code. So the federal income tax code allows you to deduct the interest that you pay on your mortgage. But most families in the middle class actually don't qualify for that. So you only get the advantage of this if you deduct taxes, if you don't take the standard deduction, if you itemize, and if you have a big enough mortgage that the interest that you pay is pretty substantial. So the mortgage interest deduction is pretty beneficial to sort of the upper half of the middle class, and particularly people who live in expensive areas where the value of their home is high, the value of their mortgage is high. But the sort of the bottom half of the middle class generally isn't getting that much of the tax benefit from this. And they're mostly people who can cover some of the housing expenses. They're not going to qualify for a subsidy based on their income, but the way we've constructed this with sort of tax treatment for wealthier homeowners and then some subsidies for low-income people leaves out that kind of moderate middle-income group.
Why are Americans so obsessed with home ownership, and what are both the advantages and disadvantages of that obsession?
Yeah.
And particularly in terms of policy.
Sure. I mean, the U.S. has really rested on homeownership as a wealth-building strategy and also sort of as a marker of making it. So homeownership has been promoted by presidents from both parties for decades as sort of this is the American dream. You buy a house with a white picket fence in the suburbs. We have sort of lots of other policies like subsidies for federal highways that have encouraged people not just to buy a home, but to buy a single-family detached home in the suburbs and think of that as sort of the ideal. That works for some people. There's some downsides from that also in terms of environmental impacts. We've encouraged people really to sprawl and move out quite far. And we sort of have this fixed idea that that's the right housing choice for most people, and we want to push people into it as much as possible. For some people, that's a way of building wealth. For some people, buying a single-family house has actually been a way to lose wealth if you buy at the wrong time in the market or in the wrong location. And then there are people who will just never be able to afford a home or choose not to. There's some limitations. If you buy a house, it makes it a little bit harder to pick up and move someplace for a new job to start over. And so there's some cost to making that decision and trying to root yourself.
Right. The middle class, on our definition, includes a growing number of people who are renting their properties rather than buying their properties. I think I understand your work to suggest that we don't do well by renters in the current policy framework, which includes those middle class renters. So is policy tilted against renters in favour of home ownership, and what could we do to help middle class people who are renting their homes as opposed to buying their homes?
our policy definitely favors homeowners over renters. In addition to sort of the federal tax policy, we've just tended to care more about the well-being of homeowners, say from a consumer protection standpoint. So one of the things that came out of the Great Recession was that we worried people were taking out mortgages without really understanding the terms of the mortgage. And so there's a whole set of new rules and federal oversight and guidelines about what you have to learn before you sign your mortgage. So very strict kind of disclosure of terms. We have no equivalent of that for renters. The relationship between renters and their landlords is governed by states, so there isn't really a federal policy framework around that. And some states have made it very easy for landlords to kick out tenants for relatively minor infractions of their lease. So we essentially haven't said it's important to make renting a stable and long-term housing choice. We're just going to try to get people into homeownership as quickly as possible, and in parts by making renting not a very good experience.
Let's talk about Las Vegas. You've just published a report with Brookings Mountain West as part of our collaboration around the middle class in Las Vegas, specifically on housing here. So can you talk a bit about the housing market in Las Vegas generally, first of all? Obviously, the housing market's had something of a roller coaster ride in the last few years. Your report is titled, "Should Las Vegas Bet on Homeownership?" I think it's one of those questions in a title that sort of suggests that there's an answer coming towards the bottom of the piece. But
yes.
Talk a bit about how the Las Vegas housing market has kind of performed, good and bad, over the last 15, 20 years in your report.
Sure. So Las Vegas, like a lot of the other Western metros, really had a boom in the 2000s, both in the sense of building a lot of units. It grew very rapidly, and prices also went up by quite a lot. So in the early 2000s, nationwide housing prices were going up, but Las Vegas saw much steeper increases in housing prices in the early parts of the 2000s. Then when the recession hit, it had a correspondingly larger drop. So the prices in Las Vegas are much more volatile than in the country overall, bigger upswings, bigger downswings. Prices have stabilized a little bit, but it looks like we're also getting back towards the sort of high cost region. It's a little bit less affordable for people to buy a house here now.
And what about any gaps by race or ethnicity, for example? We know that there are very big gaps nationally, particularly around things like home ownership, but more broadly, I know you've dug into that in your report. What can you say about race gaps, both historically and kind of going forward, specifically in the Las Vegas housing market?
Yeah. So the homeownership rate in Las Vegas has fallen over the last 10 or 15 years. Some of this was just due to the Great Recession. People lost their homes through foreclosure. But in Las Vegas, the homeownership rate overall is still declining. And when you break that down by race and ethnicity, it's really because homeownership among Black and Latino families has dropped by a lot. So white and Asian families have pretty much recovered. About 65 to 70% of them own their homes. There's about a 20 percentage point gap between white families and Latino families, and a 30 percentage point gap for Black families. And this is pretty disturbing that you see sort of a downward trend, not just in the recession, but a continuing downward trend after the Great Recession. And so families that lost their homes have not been able to get back, and new people sort of coming into the housing market have not been able to buy homes.
Right. So summarizing the bad news, there's volatility, big boom, big bust, and wide and possibly growing race gaps, particularly around home ownership. But I think you find some good news too about the Las Vegas housing market. There are some things that it's doing well compared to other metros, and some reasons to be kind of hopeful too. What's the other side of the ledger? What's the good news about Las Vegas?
So Las Vegas is still a relatively affordable housing market compared to, say, California or most of the Northeast coast. It's been a very growth-friendly metro. So when more people move here and they need more houses, they build more houses. Mm-hmm. You know, the tour that I went on Monday was just phenomenal. The developments out to the southwest, they're building tens of thousands of homes, and they build them quickly, which is really important. So when you have people move to a metro area, if it takes you 7 years to build a development, in the meantime, you're sort of bursting at the seams. Las Vegas has been very good at absorbing population growth and building more housing quickly to accommodate that, and so they've had upwards price movement, but it's not because they're not building enough.
Yeah. So you work in the Metropolitan Policy Program, so most of your colleagues like cities. I think you love cities.
I love cities.
You love cities.
Yes.
This is not on the script, but I want to talk a bit about that because you've been driven around for hours just trying to get to know the city, and I know from the people that are with you how much you love that. You kept jumping out to take photographs and geeking out about it. You've been riding buses around town, you've been walking around the city and getting a sense of it. What is it about cities that you love so much?
Cities they're vibrant places, and it's where you see people interacting with one another and people interacting with space. I particularly like being able to walk and ride transit because you get a sense of what people's daily lives are like. So the bus ride that I took, first of all, Las Vegas has a pretty friendly system for using the bus. So they have a nice website, you can download the app. It's actually pretty easy to navigate, which is not true for a lot of places where transit's not a big thing. And when I got on the bus, it was practically full. So this was 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. There were a bunch of people who were clearly going home from work, people going to work, and a pretty broad cross-section, I would say, economically. So it's an interesting place to observe how people are interacting with their space, with their environment. You get a sense of people's travel patterns, walking around the city. I will say Las Vegas could do some work on their pedestrian infrastructure. It's a city that's built for cars. And I think that's one of the things they'll need to grapple with going forward, because for a lot of people, owning a car is an expense that they can't really afford. If you have to rely on a car to get to work, that's an extra item on your monthly budget. It's really easier for working class people if they can get to and from work reliably with public transportation. And I think Las Vegas hasn't really provided that yet.
If you're, whether you're a city, a state, federal policymaker, an institution that wants to help with housing, a non-profit, etc., where do you think we should be looking in terms of policy solutions or interventions to help people? You talked a bit about wealth building, you've talked a bit about the market, but I think you conclude the paper with some thoughts as to ways, the direction of travel that policymakers at those different levels should be pursuing, including in Las Vegas, but also Nevada more broadly, and indeed, even beyond that. Where should we be pushing in terms of policy?
So I think it is really important to think about this question: how can we make renting a better experience, a more predictable and stable experience for people who are going to be renters, particularly people who will rent for long periods of time? And that in large part is going to rely on state governments, because states do set out this framework for tenant rights and tenant protections. One of the potential sort of low-hanging fruit is just for tenants to be able to sign multi-year leases for an apartment. So this is already pretty common in the commercial real estate market, signing a 5 or 7 year lease. If renters want to be able to stay in their same apartment, their same neighborhood, send their kids to the same school, and know what they're going to be paying beyond just a 1 year lease, we should give them that option. That's just a contract between landlords and tenants, and that's something that would be relatively easy to do. States could also do a better job of clarifying some of these tenant protections. What kind of advance notice does a landlord need to give a tenant before they raise the rent on you by 10 or 20%, so that people have time to move out, or potentially even offering some relocation assistance? So these are some questions that don't necessarily involve a big subsidy. It's just providing some more information and a legal framework for renters. Yeah,
that's great. I think one of the things we sometimes underestimate in policy is the importance of stability, security, and predictability. I think that's true around income, it's true around wages, true about housing more generally. It's just actually what a lot of people say that they need is to know what's going to happen, or to minimize the risk of something different happening. The sense of living at the mercy of somebody else that you get when you just don't know year on year what you're going to be paying, etc., versus being, I can plan, people want. And so there's issues about security and stability, I think, they're not only at the heart of housing policy issues, although they clearly are there, but more broadly. And I think that's what a lot of middle-class families would say. Right? It's not everybody's desperate to sort of rush to the top quintile and make lots of money, and although everyone should have the opportunity to do that, what a lot of people say, I just want to know. Yeah. And I think that what you're saying is that the rental market doesn't provide that kind of stability and security.
That's right.
Especially for families. Especially
for families. The rental market provides less stability than homeownership, which is one of the reasons why people have tended to try to become homeowners. But we could make renting more stable. This is more common in European countries for people to be renters for longer periods of time, to have more stable and predictable rents and more tenant protections. Going along with that, it would help families to have a little bit of a nest egg. So many families, even in the middle class, have essentially no liquid savings to tap into. For both owners and renters, this is really important. So if you own your house and you have an unexpected maintenance problem, your air conditioning breaks in the middle of the summer, you need to have a couple $1,000s to be able to tap into to fix that problem. For renters, especially who work, the kinds of jobs where your hours change, having a little bit of money set aside in case you have an unexpected sort of shortfall in income or a health problem or need to fix your car, just having a little bit of savings would make it possible for people to weather these sort of unexpected things that happen. We haven't done a good job of setting up vehicles to do that, right? So going back to kind of the policy framework, we have incentives for people to put a bunch of money into a house, but then it's not easy to extract that for short-term needs. You know, our retirement savings has essentially been pushed onto the private sector. You have a 401k through your employer, but that's again designated for retirement. That's not money that you can tap into for short-term income shortfalls. So it would be really helpful to have some programs that are designed to use a forced savings mechanism, and preferably with some tax matches, especially for low-income people who really don't have a lot of extra in their budget, but encouraging them to put a little bit aside every month and to match that with some tax subsidies would be very helpful.
So there are other ways to build wealth other than just the houses. Well, I'd encourage everyone to read your new report for Brookings Mountain West and your work generally for Brookings and for Future of the Middle Class Initiative. I think there's a lot more work to be done, not only in Las Vegas, but Nevada more broadly and the Southwest around housing.
Yes.
And so I think it was your first, I know it was your first time as a scholar visiting UNLV. Was it your first time in Las Vegas?
I've been here for conferences.
You've been here for conferences, but your first time riding around on buses.
Yes.
The first time you've got into the city,
yes,
which you love to do. You've got under the skin of the city.
And in fact, they explained to me that the Strip is not part of the city. The Strip is part of unincorporated Clark County. So I had to get on a bus and go to the downtown area to be physically in the city of Las Vegas.
That's part of the problem, is that people think of that. They think that's Las Vegas, right? They don't. But you've come to the city,
yes,
rather than to the Strip, and you've seen it. And given the work that you've done here, it seems like it's not impossible that we could entice you to come back and do a bit more work.
I think we could do that.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.